You're listening to Anatomy for Life with Crystal and Nicole, where we discuss the anatomy behind the most popular physical and spiritual practices so you can get the most out of these modalities on your healing journey. Welcome to Anatomy for Life podcast today. I am so excited because Hannah agreed to come on and help share just some knowledge, some things about her journey and her expertise with us that I think it's going to help me, and I think it's really going to help some things we've been talking to you guys about on here. And I'm so grateful you're here. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about your career and your licenses?
Yeah, sure. So I am licensed as a therapist here in the state of Utah, and sometimes I do therapy. But right now, the bulk of my professional life is functioning as and they call us by different names depending on the study, usually not therapist, but essentially functioning as a therapist on a number of different clinical trials where we're studying psychedelic medicines for different conditions. It's a fun type of work to do because we're doing these clinical trials on medications, but they, if approved eventually by the FDA, will be prescribed in conjunction with therapy. So as a part of these research protocols, there are sessions wrapping up what we call the dosing sessions, where the participant actually receives the psychedelic medicine. So I've been on, right now we're doing an LSD study for generalized anxiety disorder, been on a psilocybin study. I have done quite a bit of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and that's kind of happened in a number of different ways too. Sometimes we do a psychedelic dose of ketamine, and the therapy or the work around that is around integrating whatever came up in that experience, or using the kind of openness that ketamine creates to really do deep therapeutic work. Sometimes we give ketamine in these low doses because it just helps people open up to the therapy process a little bit more, but they're still, pretty coherent, and we're able to do therapy even while the medicine's on board. I also just started a little platform called Yoga Drugs Therapy, so yogadrugstherapy.com, and this is going to be a platform that my partner and I, he's a psychedelic psychiatrist, use as a way to really educate people about psychedelic healing, because it's new and because there are above ground or legal realms as well as these kind of underground realms. We're just realizing more and more how difficult it can be for people that are interested to figure out how to navigate that world. So we're going to use this platform and website as a way to educate people as well as to announce different events. One of my new passions is around organizing retreats. For example, I have a motherhood retreat coming up I'm particularly excited about. So yeah, outside of that, I'm a mom of a 4-year-old, hot yoga practitioner and teacher. Human that tries to be most loving at the moment. So there's my introduction.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Yes, most amazing human, and I'll just add to most amazing yoga practitioner, and the things that you say and participate in, have really spoken to me. They've really resonated with me. I love the way you approach things and the way you speak about things. I love that resource. We'll tag it again at the end, and I'll put it in the comments so people can have that resource. That is the biggest question I think I hear all the time. How do I get information about this? I hear people talking about their journeys or their therapy, or even that they have received some progress or benefit from this, and then they don't know where to go, right? Or they don't know how to pass on their sources legally, right? Or whatever that means right now, which I do want to ask you about. Yeah. But the other burning question is, who are your clients? Like, who are your patients, and like what kind of people can benefit from this? Like, if people are listening and they're like, well, would that help me? Like, am I a candidate? Because I wonder who you think it could benefit, and I'm also curious about who's participating in the studies.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So to start with that kind of first question that you hear often about, how do I access this? What do I do? There's kind of a spectrum of options for people, and I'm glad that you asked this, because more recently I'm realizing how much this picture needs to be painted for people. Like, for example, I gave this talk recently, and it was a 4-part talk at a business conference in San Francisco, and I thought we did a pretty good job at painting the pictures around, like, some of these medicines are in clinical trial phase right now. They're not approved by the FDAs. There are also out of country retreats that people can go to and work with plant medicines legally under the guidance typically of a shaman. But after the talks, there were countless people that came up to me afterwards and they're like, I'm confused. Like, is this legal or is it not legal? So I'm happy to kind of paint the picture with the, like, what is fully legal, medicalized in the psychedelic realm right now? Like, really, you have ketamine. And ketamine is a great therapy accelerator for a lot of people. It's also a rapid antidepressant for about 75% of people that use it, which is great compared to something like SSRIs, which have been the standard of treatment, Prozac and different medicines like that. So there's ketamine that you can receive in clinics all over the United States right now, fully legal, approved for a number of mental health conditions, depression, eating disorders, PTSD, for example. Then there are also, and this would also fall under the legal umbrella, clinical trials for psilocybin, LSD, pretty soon 5-MeO-DMT, and DMT.
I heard of MDMA. Is that one in clinical trial study right now?
An MDMA. And I'm glad you mentioned that. MDMA is the furthest one along in the clinical trial process. So, you know, we'll hopefully see that in clinic by the end of next year or the following year. So it'll kind of be, you know, close to ketamine, but again, prescribed with therapy and probably prescribed with these pretty rigid therapy protocols that include like up to 45 hours of therapy alongside 2 or 3 dosing sessions with MDMA.
Wow.
So everything that's happening in clinical trials right now is legal, but in a lot of these studies, you have to meet the criteria for a specific condition. It has to be the primary condition. There are a lot of exclusionary criteria. So for example, we might have a psilocybin study for major depression, but if someone also has another condition that seems pretty predominant that might not qualify for the study, they also might get placebo if enrolled in a study. Just because all of this is still in research, there's this placebo group that won't get medicine. So it's a cool opportunity to participate in a clinical trial because these participants are getting to contribute to the field of research that is going to eventually make these medicines available. And if any listeners are interested, cedarclinicalresearch.com. You can see where all of our studies are.
And that's where you can like apply to be part of a clinical trial or things like that.
Exactly. Yep. So you can apply to be on a clinical trial. The participants that we get in those studies are probably unique compared to what you would find if you were doing underground psychedelic work, because a lot of these participants, they've never had a psychedelic experience. A lot of them have never had an experience of anything mind-altering, but they're open to doing something like this because it's under the medical umbrella, you know. So it's kind of a neat way for people who wouldn't otherwise have these experiences to have these experiences and be transformed. So that's another way to kind of get involved. And then out-of-country retreats is another way that a lot of people pursue. And some of these retreats are led by medical professionals, licensed therapists. Some follow more of a shamanic path. Some work with plant medicines. Most of those are probably going to be focused on plant medicines. But out-of-country retreats is another legal option. And then there are a lot of underground guides that are really gifted, really skilled, really experienced, who work with people because they, you know, I think they figure this is a healing modality that needs to be accessed. I'm willing to take risks and do this work illegally or underground in order to provide this to people. The kind of risk for participants in pursuing that route is not all underground guides are created equal. Like, some of them are really experienced and come from these lineages of people doing this work for years and years and years, but not everyone, you know, meets that criteria. So I would say that's kind of the spectrum of ways to get involved in this work.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned that too, because I feel like you also went through the type of conditions that somebody could have that could be benefited from this type of therapy. So depression, anxiety, PTSD, those are some of the big ones I've heard of, if you want to add to those. And then some of the criteria for whether you're going out of country or you're trying to find an underground facilitator, what are some of the red flags and green flags that maybe you should look for? What are some of the questions you should ask?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I'll comment too on some of the additional reasons why someone might seek treatment. Our LSD study, for example, is for generalized anxiety disorder. MDMA right now, PTSD is like really what they're applying it to in clinical trials. But on the horizon, hoping to see application for couples therapy. So it has some really like promising potentials for that work too.
That's incredible.
But people also seek out psychedelic healing when they don't have a diagnosis of some kind, and I think that's a great reason. Like
that's what I wanted to hear you say. That's what I was so interested in, because I think a lot of people, once you start down this journey, have some sort of self-diagnosed trauma, right? Or something that's maybe doesn't have a medical history, but you know, or doesn't even have a legal history, but you know, or maybe you don't want to jump through the hoops of getting something diagnosed for whatever reason. There's many reasons.
Yeah.
Like my husband's in the military,
Yeah.
and so when things come up, even with PTSD, which is acceptable and there's help for that now, there is a detriment to your career or other things for getting a diagnosis. So I was wondering if you were going to touch on that. If people just felt like there's childhood things, there's patterns I'm seeing in myself, there's behaviors that are not serving me, there's unconscious things going on, is this something that's for me?
Oh, exactly. Like what's probably becoming a little bit of a cliche that I like to say is, if you are born in a people suit, you have trauma. And that, I mean, trauma is anything that's so overwhelming that we have a hard time processing it at the time that it occurs. So it gets stuck in our brain and our body in the form of memories, in the form of negative beliefs, like I'm alone, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm in danger, I'm not safe, in the form of really intense emotions and their related reactions. Like we all have that, right? We're all liable to get triggered into some past pain that's now being pulled into the present, and so that's a signal that we all have some healing work to do. But we also, like healing work, I like to separate from the work of growth or even transcendence. And that would be a good reason too to maybe pursue psychedelics alongside your healing journey. It's like, maybe I've done a bunch of the trauma work and now I just want to learn how to be my best self in the present moment. I want to learn how to connect with spirit or God. I want to learn how to transcend this body where all of my trauma is stored. So I think those are good reasons to seek this kind of work too.
I love that. I love that permission. And I love that permission even from like a licensed professional, which we touched on before. Does that give you more credit or does that give you less credit? Where is this benefiting me to put out my credentials, or is it a detriment to me? But I think there are some arenas where you have the experience, you've been through, I can't remember how many, couple hundreds of journeys you were telling me about, and you've been through this with the clients. And so to hear someone like you say, there are these other reasons that are so valid and are so beneficial and are changing people's lives for the better, is just a profound thing. And I really believe that, and I think that is good to be considered. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Let's circle back to the red and green flags, because I think this is a big thing when people are like, I've got this friend of a friend down the street, my best friend's microdosing, Todd is telling me to do this or that. That's a made up name, right? And you're like, so now I'm having these weird traumatic scenes go through my head of like, I'm gonna, go buy drugs from this guy off the street and it's gonna be really dangerous, and what do I do? So I think it's kind of a funny thing for adults to circle back to this while all these things are becoming legal and we're starting to open our minds to the therapy that can be had there in the right way. Let's lay it out for them. What is the right way?
I think that the same kind of principle to finding a therapist, or even finding like a yoga teacher who is going to be a good one for you, would apply to, how do I find someone who's going to offer me guidance around psychedelics, or even sit with me in journeys, or if they're a therapist, provide some psychedelic integration type work. Is like a good measuring stick is, can I get hints that this person is doing their own work? Like, I want my yoga teachers to be practicing yoga in depth. Like, I want them to be yoga practitioners before they're my yoga teacher. I want my therapist to be a person who has done her own inner work, goes inward, knows how to navigate that internal world, and can now show the way to me as a client. And I think that would apply too to someone who might call themselves like a psychedelic guide. Do they do their own work? Is there evidence of that in the way that they're showing up? And there is, though, you know, this may be a hard one to grasp and not quite as tangible. There is like a felt sense that we have as human beings around people that are safe. You know, we feel drawn to certain people, and a lot of times there's like this felt sense of like a knowing that this person has come into my life because they're supposed to be one of my teachers. Like, I've had that, I think, with almost all of my mentors and teachers along the way, whether they were a therapist, my spiritual guides. I had a Zen guide that I was working with for a little bit, and she was amazing. But it was like, with all of these teachers that I'm thinking about in my mind right now, the moment that I met them, I was like, yes, like, I want what you have, and I want to radiate whatever it is that I'm feeling from you right now. So that may be a good measuring stick, though a little bit less tangible.
I love that. That is how my first journey with psilocybin came to me, actually. And this practitioner now is much more advanced and holds a lot of ceremonies and whatnot. But at the time, she was newer to it. But I had that felt sense with her, and I knew that whatever was going on with me and her, and she was an energy worker, so previously we had interaction in the metaphysical realm a little bit. So I knew what that would be like, but I trusted that, and it actually worked out really well. And I don't know that I would have recommended it out loud like you just did, because I don't know where each person is on their journey, and there is something to be said for what's attracting me to this person, what's attracting me to this space, because it can come from different things. So I think if you have the internal awareness and you've built some work up around your sovereignty, and you can really tell this is a positive connection, right? And it's something that's going to evolve me. It's not something that's pulling me into my trauma or whatnot. You could go off that felt sense. I did that, and it worked out for me too. But I would definitely recommend that to someone who had done some inner work initially, right?
I know, you're so right. I was kind of thinking that in the background as I was saying that, is like, it does take a connection to that sense to be able to use that as a guide. Otherwise, go the ketamine route, go the clinical trial route, especially in the clinical trial setting. I mean, it's like there is no shortage of safety measures. Like, some of those sessions are recorded. You are meeting with this whole study team that is there to make sure that you're safe. You're following these really rigid protocols that by the time these studies are in phase 2, you know, they've been shown to do no harm to participants. Like, they've been shown that they are generally very safe.
I love that.
So that would be like the ultimate safe route to go.
I love that. And I know you do this, and I've run into other people as well who, like, sometimes you get down the road with them and you're like, let me just fill this out. And I think the way they interview you or have you apply, or the screening process for them to take you on as a client, whether it's outside of the country or in any of these methods, that makes me feel a little safer. Like, they're asking if I'm on SSRIs. They're asking me all of these things, right? And they're not so intense to treat me no matter what, right? Like, and take my money no matter what. It's almost like I felt like I've had to prove to them that I've needed that, and that makes me feel safe because I know they're looking out for medical conditions and things like that.
Yeah, there should be a screening process, and there should also be preparation work where your guide or your facilitators are getting to know you and your history, which may include like a brief trauma history, and getting to know your relationship with whatever it is that your intention is for doing this work. So like, that should be a part of the process, and if it's not, probably a red flag. It's interesting, there's this website, I think it's called retreats.something, that has all of these psychedelic retreats on it. And I was just out of curiosity kind of browsing them, And there's some good reputable ones on there. But if you kind of click on, you know, half of them and then do a little bit of sleuthing work and go find some reviews or some experiences that people have had, a lot of them are like really kind of scary, you know?
Wow.
There's some people that, you know, have had really negative experiences just choosing an out of country retreat kind of randomly and not really checking around the safety or experience of the facilitators.
I love that. And so like, let's just not be so eager that this is going to solve all your problems. It's just a step on a huge integration process. You've done work before. It's just a piece of the puzzle. You're going to do lots of integration work after, right? So maybe let's not just be so anxious to jump in and think that one thing's going to solve all your problems either, right? Because then we're just going from pharmaceuticals to an ayahuasca ceremony and treating it the same way, right?
Yeah.
So I love that you mention how it's going to be legalized and prescribed with therapy and all of these measures. That's just a more wellness approach to it. I think that's so powerful. I also think that my biggest thing is word of mouth. So if you can just get in touch with someone, that's why I love your resource you're going to put up on the website, and that you gave the clinical, the clinic's information, because that's what makes me feel safe as well.
Yeah.
As if someone's gone through it, someone can vouch for the facilitators and whatnot, and all those steps along the way, and you have a plan, post-plan, right? Post-treatment plan. That makes me feel really safe.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of my burning questions, because I'm wondering a lot about the anatomy and the neurology behind it. And I always like to add this piece in, because I think knowledge is power, and also knowledge is like a foundational building block to allow you to expand. When you understand what's happening in your body anatomically, you're just so much more bought in, and you can intentionally access like your physical body, right? And the things that are going on in your anatomy. And I do know that ketamine is one of the drugs, I have a friend who's an anesthesiologist and a brother-in-law, that they will use in general anesthesia. And I've noticed some of the same symptoms as people come out of general anesthesia, as if they were processing a medicine journey, which is just wildly fascinating to me. So I'm curious about the neurology behind ketamine, and how that varies from what's happening with the neuroplasticity in psilocybin journeys. And because I'm curious how that would make a difference for what you chose too.
Yeah.
Like, if you know what you're trying to treat, what's going on in our brains?
That's a good question. I will just be totally honest and say I am not a neuroscientist by any means. Like, coming from we're gonna get in there and do some like trauma therapy and all this.
And neither am I. But if we were, we may not say anything that makes sense to anybody anyways.
Yeah.
So,
good point.
So we'll simplify.
Yeah. And I have some of the ways that I like to present this to the like general public that has a curiosity around this. And the first one, and this applies to ketamine, which you could put in a category of more of a dissociative psychedelic. Yeah, used in anesthesia all the time, as opposed to like a classic psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin. But this actually applies to both of them. One of the things that both of these kinds of medications do is they turn down what we call the default mode network. And so there is a network in our brains that, you know, we could say is the network behind the ego, not in any kind of like negative connotation way. Like, we all have an ego. Our ego is this built up array of our judgments based on the past, our defenses that keep us safe, but then also sometimes get a little too rigid and start to hinder us. The default mode network is responsible for all of our kind of patterns, or our default modes of being in the world. It's responsible for mind wandering. So anyway, when that's turned down, our default mode, we then have access to more creativity, more openness, getting temporarily lifted outside of our normal patterns of being as that network in the brain is turned down.
So is that why they're calling it neuroplasticity, like when you're young, because you're open to making new neurological connections as opposed to just following the old pathways, like A means B, B means C?
Yeah, so when the default mode network is turned down, it's almost like I like think about it like we're kind of in these ruts of behavior and thinking and emotion. It's like being temporarily lifted outside of that rut. So we're like on the side of the trench now, and we could go, oh, what do I want to create in terms of new patterns of being? Now, that being said, those ruts have still been, you know, patterned over many years. A single psychedelic experience isn't automatically going to change them. And that's where the work around integrating happens. It's a lot easier after a psychedelic experience or anything that kind of shakes things up in our life to fall back into the old patterns. So that temporary turning down of the default mode network is not necessarily going to create the long-lasting change unless we're really intentional about it. The neuroplasticity piece is just a brain science piece related to psychedelics, and that window of neuroplasticity lasts a lot longer than the psychedelic experience itself. So with ketamine, it's approximately 48 hours that there's this window of increased neuroplasticity where if we do therapy in that 48 hours, it's more likely to stick. If someone does some new behaviors 48 hours after ketamine, maybe they go outside more. I had one client, she baked bread for the first time in 10 years, and it was like this thing that she wouldn't do in her depression, but she was able to do in those 2 days after and kind of create a new pattern out of it, for example. So if we do therapy, do new behaviors in that window of plasticity, they're more likely to stick.
Oh, that's a powerful key. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome. I do want to say this because you mentioned psilocybin, though. The window of neuroplasticity after psilocybin is longer. Like it's a week or so.
Wow.
And with LSD even longer than that, with something like ibogaine, which is prescribed, you know, in South America, Central America, most often for addictions, even longer than that, weeks long. So with different medicines, there's a different kind of window of that increased neuroplasticity, but that is part of the like medical magic of these medicines.
I love that. Is there any danger while you're in that period of neuroplasticity? Do you want to be so intentional about how you're interacting in your relationships, the behaviors you participate in? Because if you were to do a journey and then drop into a difficult situation, say like, I'm doing this journey and I know I have a family Christmas party where there's all of this triggered trauma that's going to come up for me next week, would that be a contraindication of when you choose to do something like this?
That's such an intuitive question to ask, because I will say yes and no. And yes is you want to, be careful, or like when considering who you're going to be around. For example, the day after a ketamine treatment, or the day after, you know, a more intense, longer lasting journey, you want those people around you to be safe. And what I mean by safe is you don't want to leave your journey and go home and then have someone give you a lot of judgment around choosing that on your healing path. That can be, it's like the opposite of a corrective experience that we want to land in that window of neuroplasticity. So yeah, absolutely, there should be some considerations to that. I'm also thinking about your family Christmas example too. And that's why I'm like, yes and no. And the no comes from, if your family is safe, you know, but they maybe have their differences and the way that they view things, but overall they love you at core, their hearts are pure, even if you have different styles of being in the world. It might be really neat to go do this kind of deep healing work for yourself and then go back around your family and really see if you can create a new experience in that setting. So maybe it's a new experience of, rather than like hiding myself around my family, I'm going to create this new pattern of just being there with them, or even focusing on sending love to them, or maybe just noticing the triggers in me rather than reacting on them, like just noticing them arise and seeing if I can bring what I got out of my journey to those triggers and create a new experience.
I love that so much. It could be the opportunity you've been waiting for. It could be the opportunity to step into the reason and the things that you're doing this in the first place. You want to change your outward environment by changing your inward environment first.
Yeah.
And one step, I think, closer to home even for people would be doing this with your partner. Should you do this with the person you're in an intimate relationship with? And I have heard pros and cons, and I have felt pros and cons. I have had periods in my life where I have felt that I wanted that connection so deeply. I wanted that experience and had expectations of what he would get out of it, what I would get out of it, and how it would want to go. And I felt in other times that might be the worst choice I've ever made. I might just need to work on these things separately so that we can practice that neuroplasticity window together and create the new patterns. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
That's a good question. I'm biased. Like I know that I'm biased, and I like really hold this opinion because of the nature of my own partnership of like we do the journey together, and as much as we can do any kind of ceremonial things together, it's like it's so beautiful, and it really just like amplifies the depth of the relationship. But that it probably doesn't apply across the board. And I also appreciate the balance in relationships between independence and intimacy. But a funny little story that I'll share about this that might even kind of like take the question off the table in some way is my experience has been that if one of us is going into some kind of ceremonial setting to do some healing work, separate from the other person, the other person's there too. It just like happens. Like I remember once choosing out of a ceremony that my partner went to, and I was like, nope, not feeling it. I'm gonna opt out. I had all this resistance that was coming up. So he goes and does this, and I wake up at 2:30 in the morning with a flood of like trauma, like just flooding me. And I'm like, what? So it was like I went into ceremony with him without actually being there. And the way that he needed to kind of integrate his experience and I needed to integrate that experience that came up for me was such an important part of our healing journey as a couple. Like it brought up a ton, and it was hard for a second, but we were able to like just dynamite everything that came up in the container of this like loving, conscious relationship. So I guess what I'm trying to say with that story is like when you have a conscious committed partnership, like can you do this separately? I don't know. You can try to, but
that's a really good point. And even if you are not describing your container that way at that period in your relationship, can you do it separately anyways? Maybe we're just under the illusion that we can, but we never really are.
We really are.
So you might as well just open the door and invite them in. Yes, I love that. I just wanted to share one last thing too, and maybe if you had one more experience to just illuminate another thing that I feel like I had burning on my heart before I stepped into some of these things, and I know a lot of people who ask me still do. What exactly am I getting myself into? Like there's a lot of people like, what is this gonna look like? Like, what's my body gonna do? What am I gonna feel? What am I gonna see? What am I gonna hear? Are people gonna visit me? How is it gonna change my life? And it's there's very few people I have found who are willing to just jump off the cliff into the unknown. And I've learned to be really compassionate about that, because for whatever reason, and probably again my astrology, I am just really willing to do those things and really willing to change quickly. And that is a fear-inducing process for a lot of people, and we have to be mindful of that. So I just wanted to share that I had felt some of those things, even in spite of my nature and my intuitiveness, and that I knew this was the next step in a particular scenario. And one of the things that I have kept very close to my heart and not shared, because you just don't know how it's going to be received. And like you said, you don't know how that's going to affect you in your integration of that. And so I've been pretty sovereign about that and careful, and I think you should be, that I had an experience that broke my heart open. What it was is there's nothing scary and there's nothing dark if you go into things with an open mind. If you enter something with, I'm just here to learn and everything is here to support me and love me, and a belief in divinity, I think you'll be okay. So whatever happens, there were moments where I felt cold, there were moments where I felt tired, and there were moments where I moved through different emotions. But I had gone into it with an intention to know something about myself and to know something specifically about the divine feminine, the nature of me and my matriarchal line, my mother, my grandmother, and the relationship of my mothering to my children, which kind of affects all relationships. But I had that intention in one particular scenario, and I was just held so gently and tenderly. And I was just shown so many things on a level that I think we don't hear a lot of people share the stories, because it's hard to put words to the things. And it's not because there's anything bad or scary or anything like that, but it's profound and it's sacred and it's life-changing. And there's just not words for it, but the symptom is better behavior. When you feel better, you act better. And one of the things that happened to me is my heart was open to all the shame that I had been, piling on myself, all the judgment that I had been assigning to other people. So I think I was just given opportunities and options to try out different things and ideas that didn't have to box me in anymore. And it was very emotional. And there was a long period of time, I would say up to 1 or 2 weeks, where I was continuing to feel the integration, but I was really supported. And there are behaviors that have changed permanently for me in one session that make me feel more peaceful, more sovereign, show up in the way I need and want to. And ultimately, I have been able to observe myself from the outside and acted the way I wanted to act, and been able to portray the love and compassion that I feel and see inside. And it's just more connected. And I know that may still sound a little vague, but I think that's helpful.
So helpful. For
people saying, what's gonna happen to me, right? And where do you see the differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just shared, and thanks for sharing that, so cool.
Thank you, thanks for saying that.
You almost hit on all of the things that I try to tell people, like, these are the things that you may experience. You may experience feeling like you're dying. You may experience insights, like these acute kind of insights, like you, I think, called them messages, but yeah, these usually on the other side of that kind of dying, letting go, maybe even what feels challenging for a moment or is associated with fear. Usually if you can pass through that, and medicines like this help you do that because they reduce the fear, on the other side is this insight that usually comes up, like moments of clarity. There's also a lot of times emotional breakthrough, and you talked about that too, like being able to move through different emotions that maybe you had been able to keep in the shadows until the medicine could kind of draw it out. Like that's, those are kind of the key features of experiences that are transformative. Like, so the most transformative psychedelic experiences have a mystical experience component, which is that experience of oneness, the experience of transcending our normal sense of self. Like, I am not this little separated thing in this body. Like, I really am so much more than that. And there's also associated with the mystical experience, the word that we use is ineffable, meaning you can't put words on it. Like, it's transcending what we can normally put words on, though some poetic people can get really good at that. It's impressive when they can. There's usually emotional breakthrough, and there's usually these acute insights that arise.
I love that. Oh my goodness. I feel like we have such a good handle to cover the full spectrum of just opening the subject up to people. Maybe they already knew about it and now they know more and now they have resources. Before we end, I'm wondering if you will spout off those resources a few more times, and I will put them in the show notes. And if you need to get a hold of me, I've started a new crystalsinyoga.com where you can subscribe and stay up to date on these things, and you can also contact me and get a hold of Hannah if you need to. And also a new Instagram where we're doing all anatomy stuff. So I'll probably post something on there as well to tag you and plug you, and so people can get more info. And it's Zen Yoga. It's on Instagram. And will you give your resources?
Yeah, so yogadrugstherapy.com.
Okay.
Good place for resources. Assuming that a lot of listeners are going to be in this like state of Utah, since that's where we are, cedarclinicalresearch.com is a great place to get involved in clinical trials if that feels like the right route for you. Also, on Instagram is Psychedelic Institute, which is a nonprofit I'm associated with, related to psychedelic education and fundraising and meetups and community.
I love that. I love the work you're doing. And
Thank you.
I love that you were so gracious to be here today. And I love your friendship, and I love practicing yoga with you.
Likewise.
So thank you.
Likewise.